Imagine discovering a hidden flaw inside capitalism. Not corruption, not greed, not moral failure, but mathematical imbalance buried deep within the financial system itself. Not a conspiracy, not a scandal, simply an accounting rule that quietly shapes the entire economy. Now imagine realizing that because of this rule, consumers may never have quite enough money to buy everything the economy produces. And imagine believing that poverty, debt, and economic instability could be fixed, not with revolution, not with ideology, but with a simple equation. In the early 20th century, one man came to exactly that conclusion. His name was Clifford Hugh Douglas. Douglas was not a politician, not a banker, and not even a formally trained economist. He was an engineer, a man trained to analyze systems, identify faults, and design solutions. And when he looked at the financial system, he believed something fundamental didn't add up. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and where the deeper you look into economic systems, the more complicated they become. This is the story of the man who tried to debug capitalism using mathematics, and why, even a century later, echoes of his ideas still appear in debates about inflation, debt, stimulus programs, and universal basic income. Because Douglas wasn't merely criticizing capitalism. He was questioning the mechanism that makes capitalism function. And when you question the mechanism, you inevitably question the power behind it. To understand Douglas's ideas, we have to travel back to the world that shaped him. Clifford Hugh Douglas was born in 1879 in England during the height of the British Empire. It was a period when Britain dominated global trade, controlled vast territories, and sat at the center of the world's industrial revolution. By the time Douglas reached adulthood, the world had transformed dramatically. Factories powered by steam and electricity could produce goods at a scale unimaginable just a century earlier. Railroads connected cities and continents. Ships carried goods across oceans. Industrial production exploded. Humanity had unlocked an extraordinary ability to manufacture wealth. And yet, something strange remained. Despite all this progress, poverty never disappeared. Workers produced more goods than ever before, but many still struggled to afford the basic necessities of life. Entire communities lived precariously, trapped between unstable wages and rising living costs. The early 1900s were filled with labor strikes, economic instability, and growing frustration with industrial capitalism. Then came World War I, a conflict that forced entire nations to mobilize their economies. Factories that once produced civilian goods were suddenly manufacturing weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and supplies at massive scale. Governments coordinated production, finance, and logistics with unprecedented intensity. The war proved something extraordinary. Industrial economies possessed enormous productive capacity. But when the war ended, Europe was financially devastated. Debt exploded. Currencies weakened. Economies struggled to stabilize. And it was during this turbulent era that Douglas began noticing something peculiar. While working as a chief engineer in various industrial enterprises, including aircraft manufacturing during the war, Douglas had access to corporate accounting records. As an engineer, he approached these records the same way he would approach a machine. He studied them carefully. He analyzed their structure. And eventually, he believed he had found a pattern, one that suggested the financial system itself contained a built-in imbalance. Douglas noticed that businesses typically recorded two broad categories of costs. The first category consisted of payments made directly to individuals. These included wages, salaries, and dividends paid to workers and shareholders. Douglas called these payments. The second category included payments made to other organizations. These covered things like bank interest, equipment depreciation, raw materials, and various overhead costs. Douglas labeled these payments. At first glance, this seemed like ordinary accounting, but Douglas believed something important was hidden within this structure. He argued that only a payments, wages, and salaries enter consumers' pockets as purchasing power. In other words, this was the money people could actually spend in stores. However, when companies priced the goods they produced, those prices included both A and B costs. The final price of a product reflected the entire cost of production, which meant total prices equals A plus B, but total consumer income equals A. According to Douglas, this created a permanent gap. The economy produced goods priced at A plus B, but consumers only received A in income. That meant, in theory, consumers as a group could never afford to buy everything produced. There would always be more prices in the system than purchasing power. The implications of this idea were explosive. Even if factories operated efficiently, even if workers were productive, even if shelves were full of goods, consumers would still never have enough income to purchase everything without additional money entering the system. According to Douglas, the financial system therefore required constant injections of credit to function. Consumers borrowed money. Businesses borrowed money. Governments borrowed money. Alternatively, countries tried to export excess production to foreign markets, shifting the purchasing gap abroad. Or they engaged in massive government spending during wars, which temporarily filled the demand gap through state borrowing. In Douglas's view, debt wasn't simply an unfortunate side effect of capitalism. It was structurally necessary. The system depended on expanding credit to keep goods moving through the economy. If credit expansion slowed, the gap between production and purchasing power would widen. Goods would remain unsold. Factories would reduce production. Workers would lose jobs. And economic crises would follow. To Douglas, financial recessions weren't mysterious. They were inevitable consequences of the system's design. Importantly, Douglas did not believe capitalism itself was the enemy. In fact, he believed capitalism had unlocked incredible productive potential. Factories, machines, and modern technology could produce more goods than humanity had ever seen. The real problem, he argued, was not production. It was distribution of purchasing power. And unlike many political thinkers of his time, Douglas framed his argument not in terms of class struggle or ideology. He framed it as an engineering problem, a system malfunction, a mathematical imbalance. He called this idea the A plus B theorem, according to Douglas, because prices included both A and B payments. While consumers received only A payments as income, the system required continuous credit creation to close the gap. Without this credit, economies would collapse into deflation and unemployment. Mainstream economists strongly disagreed with his analysis. They argued that B payments eventually become someone else's income. When businesses pay suppliers, those suppliers pay workers. Those workers then spend money in the economy. In other words, income circulates through complex economic chains. But Douglas wasn't focused only on circulation. He was focused on control and timing. Who decides when credit is created? Who controls the money supply? Who benefits from the expansion of debt? These were questions that went beyond accounting. They were questions about financial power. And this is where Douglas moved from critique to proposal. He did not want to abolish markets. He did not advocate nationalizing all industry. He did not call for a socialist revolution. Instead, he proposed modifying the financial system so that purchasing power would match the economy's productive capacity. His proposed system became known as social credit. At its core, social credit was built on a simple principle. If modern economies can produce abundance, then citizens should have enough purchasing power to access that abundance. Douglas proposed two major mechanisms. The first was called the national dividend. Under this system, every citizen would receive periodic payment from the state, not as welfare, not as charity, but as a rightful share of national productivity. Douglas believed that modern wealth creation depended heavily on accumulated knowledge, technology, and infrastructure built by previous generations. Therefore, the benefits of this collective progress should be shared by society as a whole. The second mechanism was known as the compensated price system. In this model, retail prices would be partially subsidized through state-issued credit, so that the prices consumers paid would better reflect the real productive efficiency of the economy. Essentially, the government would adjust prices downward to ensure that total purchasing power matched total production. Douglas believed that banks had enormous power because they created money primarily through lending. He wanted money creation to be tied directly to real productive capacity rather than private credit decisions. In his view, this would stabilize the economy and eliminate the chronic shortage of purchasing power. Douglas wasn't trying to overthrow capitalism. He was trying to repair it. But theory and politics rarely mix easily. Douglas's ideas gained popularity during the 1920s and 1930s, a time when economic instability shook public confidence in traditional financial systems. The Great Depression devastated economies around the world. Factories sat idle. Millions were unemployed. Yet warehouses remained full of goods that people could not afford to buy. To many observers, Douglas's arguments suddenly seemed less abstract. His ideas gained followers in Britain and spread internationally. In Canada, social credit became a powerful political movement. In 1935, during the depths of the Great Depression, the Social Credit Party achieved a stunning electoral victory in the province of Alberta under the leadership of William Aberhart. Their campaign promised to distribute social credit dividends directly to citizens. For the first time, Douglas's theories were being tested in real politics. But implementing those ideas proved far more difficult than proposing them. The Alberta government attempted to introduce financial reforms inspired by social credit principles. However, Canada's federal government and courts intervened. Many of the proposed laws were ruled unconstitutional. Banking authority remained under federal jurisdiction. The experiment gradually stalled. Meanwhile, mainstream economists continued to criticize Douglas's framework. One of the most influential critics was John Maynard Keynes, who dismissed Douglas's economic analysis as fundamentally flawed. According to Keynesian economists, Douglas misunderstood the complex circulation of income within modern economies. But the deeper issue wasn't purely academic. It was institutional. If the authority to create credit shifted away from private banking systems and toward national dividend mechanisms, the entire structure of financial control would change. And shifts in power rarely happen easily. Over time, the social credit movement also developed internal problems. Some followers began promoting conspiracy theories about international banking elites. These narratives damaged the intellectual credibility of the movement and made it easier for critics to dismiss social credit as fringe economics. In the end, Douglas's legacy became complicated. His critique of financial structure was intriguing. But the political movements built around it often struggle with coherence and credibility. Yet, before dismissing Douglas as a historical curiosity, consider something important. Many of the economic tensions he identified still exist today. Modern industrial economies produce extraordinary amounts of wealth. Technology continues to boost productivity. Automation and artificial intelligence are making production even more efficient. Yet wage growth in many developed economies has lagged behind productivity gains for decades. Household debt levels remain high. Governments frequently inject massive stimulus during economic crises. Central banks expand balance sheets to stabilize financial systems. After the 2008 global financial crisis, governments poured trillions of dollars into financial institutions and markets to prevent economic collapse. Then in 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, governments in several countries sent direct payments to citizens. Stimulus checks, emergency support, income supplements. These policies looked, at least superficially, similar to Douglas's idea of a national dividend. Of course, policymakers today do not call it social credit. They call it fiscal stimulus, or quantitative easing, or emergency economic relief. But the underlying instinct is surprisingly familiar. When economies face a demand shortage, governments inject money into the system to sustain consumption. Douglas argued that capitalism could produce abundance, but that purchasing power sometimes needed structural adjustment. Modern policymakers, confronted with economic shocks, often reach for similar tools. The difference lies mostly in how the solution is framed. Douglas believed the gap he identified wasn't temporary. He believed it was permanent. Mainstream economists, however, saw things very differently. In their view, the economy might experience short-term imbalances, periods where production outpaced demand or demand temporarily surged ahead of supply. But over time, the system corrected itself. In other words, what Douglas saw as a structural flaw, economists saw as a cyclical fluctuation. And it's inside that disagreement between permanent defect and temporary imbalance that this story becomes far more interesting, because Douglas wasn't convinced the system balanced itself in any meaningful way. He argued that even if money eventually circulated through the economy, the timing and structure of credit creation mattered enormously. Income might eventually flow from one part of the system to another, but if purchasing power didn't reach consumers quickly enough, production could stall. Factories could produce goods faster than consumers could buy them. Demand would weaken. Businesses would cut output. Workers would lose wages. And the cycle would begin again. In Douglas's view, the system wasn't just imperfect. It was dependent on continuous credit expansion to function. Without expanding debt, he believed demand would inevitably fall short of production. At this point, the debate stops being about accounting equations and becomes something deeper. It becomes a debate about financial architecture. Because Douglas believed banks occupied a uniquely powerful position within the modern economy. In most modern financial systems, commercial banks create the majority of money through lending. When a bank issues a loan, it does not simply transfer existing money. It creates new deposits in the borrower's account. In effect, new purchasing power enters the economy. But this new money comes with a condition. It is debt, and debt comes with obligations. The borrower must repay the principal, and they must also pay interest. That repayment requires future income. Douglas believed this dynamic embedded instability into the system. If consumers must continually borrow in order to purchase what industry produces, then the economy becomes permanently dependent on expanding credit. When credit expands, spending rises. When credit tightens, spending falls. And when debt burdens become too heavy, the system becomes fragile. Sound familiar? Consider the 2008 global financial crisis. For years leading up to the crisis, credit expanded rapidly, particularly in housing markets. Mortgages became easier to obtain. House prices climbed. Homeowners borrowed against rising property values. Consumption surged. But when credit markets froze, purchasing power contracted almost overnight. Demand collapsed. Financial institutions faltered. Unemployment surged. And government around the world were forced to intervene with massive liquidity injections to stabilize the system. Was this proof of Douglas's A plus B theorem? Not exactly. But it did reveal something Douglas instinctively understood. Modern economies are deeply dependent on credit expansion. And when that expansion stops, the consequences can be severe. But Douglas's argument went even deeper. He believed the nature of industrial society was changing in a way that traditional economic thinking struggled to address. Machines were increasingly performing work once done by human labor. Technological innovation was compounding across generations. Productivity was rising rapidly, but wages, which were tied to human labor, did not necessarily rise at the same pace. If machines produce more goods while wages remain relatively constrained, then the primary channel through which purchasing power enters the economy, labor income, may not grow quickly enough to match production. This idea feels strikingly modern. Today, debates about automation, artificial intelligence, and the future of work raise similar questions. If technology dramatically increases productivity but concentrates wealth among capital owners, how should purchasing power be distributed across society? Douglas offered a direct answer. He believed citizens should receive a dividend from national productivity. Every individual, he argued, had a legitimate claim to what he called the cultural inheritance of society, the accumulated technology, knowledge, and infrastructure built by previous generations. This dividend would not be charity. It would not be welfare. It would be a structural recognition that modern wealth is produced not only by present labor, but also by centuries of accumulated innovation. If this idea sounds familiar, it should. It bears a strong resemblance to what modern economists call universal basic income. The philosophical framing, however, was different. Modern discussions about basic income often emphasize social justice, poverty reduction, or economic equality. Douglas framed his argument in terms of system mechanics. He believed the financial system simply needed to distribute purchasing power more effectively. But here we need to be precise. Douglas's famous A plus B theorem does not hold cleanly under modern macroeconomic analysis. In contemporary national income accounting, total output in an economy equals total income. Every payment made in production ultimately becomes someone else's income. At a macro level, the system balances. Yet, that macro balance does not guarantee stability. Income distribution can become skewed. Debt can expand faster than wages. Asset prices can inflate far beyond underlying economic fundamentals. Financial bubbles can form when credit growth accelerates faster than real productivity. History shows this repeatedly. Douglas may have oversimplified the mechanics, but he identified a recurring tension that economists still debate today. Modern economies often expand their productive capacity faster than purchasing power spreads through society. That tension doesn't necessarily cause immediate collapse, but it does influence policy decisions. Consider the Great Depression of the 1930s. At its peak, unemployment in the United States reached roughly 25%. Factories sat idle. Agricultural production was abundant, yet millions of people lacked the income necessary to buy the goods being produced. To many observers, it felt like an economy capable of producing wealth, but unable to distribute it efficiently. Governments responded with enormous policy changes, deficit spending, public works programs, monetary expansion. Eventually, the massive industrial mobilization of World War II absorbed excess capacity and restored employment. Douglas interpreted events like these as evidence that credit expansion was required to bridge structural gaps. Mainstream economists later described them differently, as cyclical demand shocks that could be managed through fiscal and monetary policy. Different language, but often similar tools. Fast forward to the 21st century. After the 2008 financial crisis, central banks engaged in quantitative easing on a scale never seen before. Central bank balance sheets expanded dramatically. Interest rates fell to historic lows. Asset markets recovered. But something unusual happened. Inflation in consumer prices remained relatively subdued for years. Instead, asset inflation surged. Housing prices rose. Stock markets climbed. Wealth inequality widened. Policymakers faced a difficult balancing act. Their goal wasn't ideological purity. It was stability. They were attempting to manage a complex, credit-dependent financial system under extreme stress. Then came 2020. During the global pandemic, governments around the world took an extraordinary step. They sent direct payments to citizens. In the United States, stimulus checks were deposited directly into bank accounts. Unemployment benefits were expanded. Income support programs spread across multiple countries. Central banks and fiscal authorities coordinated policies in ways that blurred traditional institutional boundaries. Douglas would have recognized the mechanism immediately. Purchasing power was being injected directly into households. The difference was how it was framed. This wasn't described as a permanent structural reform. It was presented as emergency support. When inflation surged in 2021 and 2022, critics argued that excessive stimulus had overheated demand. Central banks responded by raising interest rates aggressively. Credit conditions tightened. The system recalibrated. And this reveals a key truth about modern financial systems. They are adaptive. During downturns, they expand credit. During inflationary surges, they restrict it. They oscillate constantly between stimulus and restraint. Douglas believed the system contained a permanent gap requiring structural reform. Modern policymakers treat instability as cyclical, something to be managed rather than fundamentally redesigned. Which interpretation is correct? History suggests the answer lies somewhere in between. Capitalism does not appear to contain a simple arithmetic flaw, but it does repeatedly generate imbalances. Credit expands. Economic bubbles form. Asset prices detach from fundamentals. Financial errors accumulate. Eventually, correction follows. What Douglas accomplished, perhaps unintentionally, was forcing attention onto something many people overlook: the relationship between production, purchasing power, and control over credit creation. And that relationship is not neutral. Money is not just a medium of exchange. It is a claim on real resources. Whoever controls its creation influences who can invest, consume, accumulate wealth, and shape the economy. Douglas challenged the concentration of that control. He believed financial systems should serve productive capacity rather than constrain it. He argued that poverty in highly productive industrial societies often reflects design choices rather than genuine scarcity. Was he completely right? No. But was he irrelevant? Absolutely not. His political movement faded. The social credit experiment in Alberta failed to transform national banking structures. Mainstream economics moved forward. Douglas gradually became a historical footnote, yet the questions he raised never disappeared. Why does debt expand so persistently in modern economies? Why do governments intervene during downturns to support demand? Why do central banks become the most powerful institutions during financial crises? And why does the financial system often appear stable only when credit is expanding? These are not fringe questions. They are central to understanding the modern global economy, because every economic system claims efficiency. But few openly admit that they also distribute power. Control over credit creation shapes business cycles. It influences who owns assets. It determines who benefits from inflation and who pays the price. It shapes who prospers during expansion and who struggles during contraction. Douglas believed he had discovered a mathematical flaw in capitalism, but what he ultimately exposed was something deeper. The structure of money determines the structure of power. If purchasing power is unevenly distributed, social tensions grow. If credit expansion masks stagnant wages, debt burdens accumulate. If economies require constant stimulus to sustain demand, stability becomes conditional. None of this means collapse is inevitable, but it does mean architecture matters. Financial literacy isn't just about memorizing investment strategies or predicting the next crisis. It's about understanding the framework within which money moves. Because the financial system is not a natural law. It is a human design, and designs can be changed. Douglas understood something fundamental. Economic abundance does not automatically translate into widespread prosperity. The channel connecting production to purchasing power can widen or narrow, depending on how income and credit are structured. History rarely rewards ideological purity. It rewards adaptability. Douglas's solutions were too rigid, too politically disruptive, and too vulnerable to misinterpretation. But his challenge remains powerful. He forced a difficult question onto the economic conversation. Does capitalism distribute income as efficiently as it produces goods? In an age defined by automation, rising debt, recurring financial bubbles, and periodic inflation, that question still echoes. You don't need to accept Douglas's mathematics to appreciate his insight. Money is a system of influence. Credit is a lever of power. And the distribution of purchasing power shapes opportunity across society. Clifford Hugh Douglas failed to rewrite capitalism, but he revealed something profound. The system is not sacred. It can be studied, it can be criticized, and it can be redesigned. History may not repeat itself exactly, but if you don't understand how money and power interact, the future will move faster than you can keep up. If this perspective challenged how you think about economics, consider subscribing, because history often hides the answers. You just have to know where to look.